readers, welcome back to Reading Realm again. Today I'm reviewing one of the books that has been on my in progress list for quite a while. And it's the one that I actually started reading a few years ago, never finished, and then finally came back and finished. This is Storm Thief by Chris Wooding. It is really interesting, and I feel like it's one of those books where at the beginning it's a little bit intense in that you're getting a lot of world building stuff kind of thrown at you really fast and trying to figure it out, and like terms for things in the world or sort of establishing dynamics or things like that. It's kind of a lot at once, but then once you get into it, it's really, really interesting. It is also a book that kind of has a couple of perspectives, and the number and people whose perspectives it is kind of changes throughout the books, or the book. It's just one book. But I really, really liked it. I think it's an interesting book because I feel like I read a lot of fantasy or sci-fi that's kind of like futuristic if it's sci-fi, or just like complete original world building if it's fantasy. But this is like sci-fi fantasy world building kind of. It's almost, I would say, maybe like steampunk, because it's sort of like there is all this fascinating technology, but a lot of people live with sort of the bare minimum in terms of like scrounging for food and stuff. But then there are also people who are super wealthy, and then there's these interesting creatures that are kind of taking over people, and all this really interesting world building. But it kind of follows two characters who are, they start out as thieves together, and then throughout the book, various things happen where they end up kind of not spending as much of the book doing thievery and started doing more running. But then there's another character who is this golem who's been created, and he really wants to try and figure out why he was made, and so that's kind of his goal. And then those storylines kind of intersect, and then there's a couple other characters whose storylines intersect. And I also just want to point out, like, the cover. This is the male protagonist, but I love the font on this cover. I think it's super cool. And also, I think it's really interesting. When I first saw this book, based on the title Storm Thief, I thought it was about people who, like, stole storms or something like that. Or, like, had power over storms or something, and that's not what it means. It's actually that the storms are not, like, rain or lightning or anything like that. They're, like, these sort of magical energy storms that can cause complete and utter chaos, basically. They can completely randomize things in the city. They can just sort of alter people's bodies. He's had that happen. They can like move where streets or houses are. They can just do pretty much whatever. And so people call it the Storm Thief, because the thief is the storm taking things from them, either by altering them physically, making them, like, suddenly be in the middle of a more dangerous area, whatever it is that the storm happens to do. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And the whole design of the storms and everything was super interesting, as well as sort of the lore about the people who created it and why. And a lot of that you only really get into at the very, very end of the book. The last, like, third of it, or maybe, like, fourth, basically this much, is so dramatic and so interesting. Not that other parts weren't dramatic, but I feel like this book kind of has kind of a lot of lulls in it, where it's like, it starts very like, here we're establishing the world building, and now we're getting into some action, and it's really interesting, and then it's kind of back down, and it's kind of up again, and the end though is just constant drama and constant just, it is a lot of world building there too, or lore or history, I guess. But it's so interesting, and I think it's also really interesting. The very, very end, the epilogue, is really, really interesting, and I can't really say anything about it without it causing a lot of spoilers, but it's just, it's not what I expected the epilogue to be. But it does feel fitting. Like, it's not a bad epilogue at all. It's just, I was a little surprised by that. But it is really good. It is a really fun book. And I think that one of the things that I actually kind of liked about it was that it wasn't just all action and suspense all the time. I think the pacing of when there were kind of lulls in it made the situations where it was more intense feel a little bit more memorable, because I feel like with some books where it's like 400 pages of only suspense, it can be a bit like so much is happening and so much is like keeping me on my toes the entire time that none of it really stands out. But with this, having those moments of like, okay, well now they're just like walking through a street for a while, versus like, okay, they are actively being hunted and they just saw the person who's after them or something like that. I think it makes it kind of stand out more. So I think, even though there are definitely parts of this book, and I hesitate to say boring, but there are parts of this book that are just not really a ton happening. Compared to other parts, there's still stuff happening in the whole book. But it makes those moments when stuff is happening stand out so much more, which I honestly really like. And I think it's also kind of interesting how the characters' dynamics are, because the two main protagonists, Rael and Moa, it's interesting because it feels to me like at the start of the book, it's kind of established that Rael is sort of like in charge. Like, he's the one who's supposed to be protecting her, he's looking out for her. He kind of makes the decisions, and I think it's kind of, I don't know if it's actually true, because I don't think it ever fully specifies specific ages, but I've always kind of gotten the sense he might be a little bit older. And he at least thinks that he's not as naive as she is, because she wants to believe in, like, chance and hope and dreams of a better world away from the world that they're in. And he's kind of just like, no, you, like, have to be selfish to survive. That's, like, all that matters is just surviving. And she's like, but what if there's something better? And so I think that is a very interesting part of it, because I think that dynamic sort of starts to shift over the course of the book, because at first it very much does seem like he's kind of calling the shots. He's kind of the one who's more aware of the full situation sometimes, because he's maybe not telling her everything to sort of protect her by her not having information or something like that. He's kind of the one who decides on the route where they go, and some things like that. But then there's sort of a moment where I feel like the dynamic shifts a little bit. And not necessarily that she's in charge at that point, but more that he starts to see her as someone who's sort of like can make decisions for herself and is thinking for herself and may not be making the same decision that he is making for himself or something like that. And I think that moment and sort of the several scenes that are leading up to that in terms of like one of the characters getting hurt, and I don't want to say anything more than that because, again, spoilers, but that, I think, kind of makes this interesting shift into, like, he doesn't really want to be open to other possibilities, but then she does, and that part is really interesting to me because I think it shows that even though throughout the rest of the book, up until that point, she was kind of going along with whatever he was deciding for them, she does think for herself, and she does have her own opinions and thoughts about what she wants and what she doesn't want, and she's actually really smart. And I think you kind of see that throughout the whole thing, but sometimes I think that he as a character doesn't see that as much. So having this moment where he's suddenly like, oh, like you're not just gonna follow everything I say because I say it at this point. I think that that's a really interesting moment. And then I think it's also just super interesting, the dynamic with the Golem, because he is a very interesting character because at the beginning, he's sort of isolated in this one place, and then he eventually is no longer there. Again, I'm being vague for spoiler purposes, but eventually the way that the storylines kind of combine is interesting. And it's also kind of, I think, another situation where the attitude toward him kind of illustrates really well the difference between Raelle and Moa as well, in terms of how they view strangers. Because Moa wants to be, like, kind and understanding, and then Raelle is just like, no, we don't need this person with us, like, tell him to go away, kind of. And so that's very interesting. And I also, it's hard to talk about the end of the book. The end of the book is so dramatic and so interesting, but it's really hard to talk about without giving too much away that would be considered a spoiler. But I will say that this is a kind of satisfying ending in the context of you get what you asked for, kind of, for several characters. And with some of them, it's definitely like, I don't think that they necessarily understood everything, but they also deserved what happened, and the fact that there are so many people who are affected, I think, is really interesting, because it doesn't really show any of that. It doesn't really show what happened at that point, because the people who are the people that the plot is following are not there at that point. So it's just very interesting how it kind of ends with something really dramatic happening, but the main protagonist not ever really having full resolution to what exactly that was. And just all of that is so interesting. And I love the way that the visuals of the Nullspire were at the end, which is a particular really important building and structure, which is basically housing a thing that causes the probability storms, which are like the storms that are the Storm Thief. Um, it's so interesting, and the technology and everything in that, it's so cool, and I really liked it. It kind of makes me wish that there was maybe not necessarily a sequel, but another book in the same universe, because I think that the universe itself is super interesting, and maybe it wouldn't follow the same people, or maybe it would, but it would be really interesting to see sort of more of that world, or the world that is beyond the actual city where they all are. But yeah, I really liked it. I think it's a little bit hard to talk about because there's a lot of stuff that does happen that I think um, gets really close to spoilers, so it's hard to say too much, but I really do recommend it. I think that it's a very fun book. I think it would also be a fun book to potentially read aloud and discuss or something, because there are some really interesting sort of moral or ethical issues that are presented about several things. And I think that that makes it really, really cool. It's something that I wish I had someone to discuss this book with, because there are moments where it's like, oh, yeah, that is so interesting, or that's really thought-provoking or something, but I don't know anyone who's read this book, so I can't really talk about it. But I do really like it. I think it's also really interesting how I feel like often books that have multiple perspectives sort of start with all of the perspectives. Not always. I can definitely think of books that are examples of that not being the case, but it's like, okay, if we're going to alternate between two perspectives, the first chapter is going to be perspective A, and the second chapter is going to be perspective B. And in this one, it's really interesting because it starts with Vago and then Rael and Moa's perspective. So it starts with two, and then as the story gets more complex and more people are kind of involved in Rael and Moa's storyline, then it adds Bane's perspective and Finch's perspective. And I think that that makes it really, really interesting, because that way it doesn't seem like you know everything and what all of the different characters are doing from the very beginning, but when they become relevant, then you start to see their perspective too. So I think that that was like a clever usage of adding more perspectives, because it does feel natural at that point, and it doesn't feel like they've been there too long just kind of waiting to have something to do by having perspectives early on just to have multiple perspectives early on. It feels really organic and well-paced and natural to have them where they happen. So I liked that part as well. Because also, especially with the sort of government side of like the secret police and stuff, it's really interesting to see their perspective on things after seeing the perspective of the people that you are actually on their side. Because the secret police are kind of the people that you're supposed to kind of be against for most of it. So it's definitely really interesting, and I really like the sort of steampunk-ish theme and setting. I think that that's really cool. It makes it kind of unique among a lot of what I've read this year that is more either fantasy or realism or more fantasy or some sci-fi stuff. Like, this is definitely one of the things where it's like, it's got such interesting world building, but I wouldn't really call it fantasy or sci-fi. I mean, maybe more sci-fi, but it's not like intergalactic spaceship exploration-y sci-fi, which I feel like is kind of the, I don't know, like, stereotype of sci-fi a lot, is that it's got some sort of, like, extraterrestrial component, which this does not, but it's kind of sci-fi in the sense of there are all these old technologies and current technologies that the modern people don't understand because they were built by the people from before. And there's, I guess, almost an element of magic as well in some of those technologies when, like, the storm creates all these different things, or the various creatures that the Nullspire also creates. And I think that it's super interesting. Just, it feels like a very, very unique book among books that I've read. So I really liked that as well. I feel like some books, they definitely get into sort of rhythms where it's like, okay, this is definitely a different book than that other one that I've read, but it sort of follows the same pattern, or something like that. And sometimes that's when they're from the same author, like a lot of Natasha Preston's books. You can kind of sort of predict things that might be happening if you've read more than one of her books. But there are also other times where it's like, if you read enough fantasy, you will read like 12 different books where the Fae falls in love with the human and the human has to make some decision to be with the Fae, or the Fae sacrifices immortality, or whatever. And it's like those storylines just kind of happen often. And that doesn't mean they're bad. I've definitely read books where it's like, oh yeah, this has a similar storyline to this, but I really like them both. But this just feels really, really unique. The world building, the plot, the sort of dynamics of characters, it's all really, really interesting and really, really good. And one of the things that I actually really like is it's made kind of clear that Raelle really likes Moa in a romantic way. And this is not a romance book at all. But it's clear that he does like her, but he never forces that on her, and he never puts her in a position where she has to decide to be with him romantically. And it's unclear whether she has any of the same feelings, but I like that that's left unresolved. Like, even at the end, he never, like, fully confesses it to her, and there are times where I feel like I think she might suspect it, but he's never like, go out with me or anything like that. And I feel like if they had a moment like that in the book, it would have felt really forced. So I really like that the author didn't do that. I think it's left in a way where maybe that happened after the plot of this book. Maybe they end up together, maybe they don't. And it's kind of reader interpretation, because pretty much all of this book is not at all about romance. And so I like that, because I feel like a lot of times where there's a male and female protagonist duo who spends all the time together, it's often that ends in romance. Even when sometimes it's not really the most natural to put romance in it. But this one doesn't do that, and I really like that, and I respect that for this story, because that's not what this story needed. But I really do recommend this book. I think it's a very, very fun book, and like I said, it does start a little bit slow for me, but once you get past a little bit of the sort of world building being thrown at you part, it becomes just super fascinating and just wanting to know what happens and how things turn out and everything. So I really liked it. I hope if you read it, you enjoy it too. Or let me know if you have read it. I feel like it's not a very common book. I've never heard anyone else talk about it. And every time I've like carried it around reading it during school or something, everyone's like, huh, I've never seen that book before. It was published in 2006, so it's not a super modern book. Actually, it's almost 20 years old. That's wild to say. But I really enjoyed it. And whether you've read this one or not, let me know what you're reading in the comments. And since this is getting close to the end of the year, let me know how your reading list goal has gone for this year and whether you've accomplished it or gotten close or not, and whether you're satisfied with that or not. And maybe let me know what one of your favorite books that you read this year was. I hope that you enjoyed this review. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and keep reading. Bye!